Hello and welcome to the Meet the Parents podcast.
Good evening and welcome to episode 75 of the Meet the Parents podcast and another 30 minutes of parenting based chat. I'm Tim from Slouching Towards Thatcham and this week I'm joined by Mark from Best Dad I Can Be. Good evening, Mark.
Tim, how are you? You sound dreadful, so let's hope you can get to the end of the podcast in one piece.
I know, I'm croaking like the Frog Prince tonight. Anyway, this week Mark and I are going to run the rule over a few parenting related stories from the past week or so that I've shamelessly grabbed from the headlines. Let's start with one of those stories that at first sounds like yet another of those articles about some internet crackpot, but where there's actually a bit of nuance behind the headline. So last week, a mum of a 6-year-old boy was widely ridiculed across both mainstream and social media for asking the school that her 6-year-old son goes to remove Sleeping Beauty because it promotes inappropriate sexual behaviour. Inappropriate how, you might ask? Well, the bit she objected to was the bit where the prince awakened Sleeping Beauty from a 100-year sleep with a non-consensual kiss. So, Mark, what was your immediate reaction to this story?
I think my immediate reaction was pretty mainstream. I always enjoyed reading fairy stories to my children, and I thought this was slightly over the top in her reaction. So yeah, my first reaction was that this was being overprotective to a ridiculous degree.
Yeah, I have to say my initial reaction was pretty similar. And when you looked on social media, the response was fairly predictable, I think. Most comments were predictably along the lines of, "This is political correctness gone mad." Now the thing is that in many cases, people react largely to a clickbait headline or maybe a sensationalist opening paragraph, but no more than that before they jump to their own conclusions. But when you actually dig into the detail of what this mum says, I do start to wonder whether she does have a point. I mean, to quote some of what she had to say, "In today's society, it isn't appropriate. My son's only 6, he absorbs everything he sees, and it isn't as if I can turn it into a constructive conversation." She also goes on to say, "I don't think taking Sleeping Beauty books out of circulation completely would be right. I actually think it would be a great resource for older children. You could have a conversation around it. You could talk about consent and how the princess might feel. But I'm really concerned about it for younger children." So when you put the argument like that, Mark, do you think maybe she has more of a point?
I think it completely falls down when she says that she can't turn it into a constructive conversation. Why not? I just wandered into the lounge and I was watching The Secret Life of 5-year-olds who were playing Kiss Chase and having a mock wedding. And I think if you say, "I can't turn this into a constructive conversation with my children," and your child is 6, that's a reasonable age to have a conversation with them. What on earth are you going to do when your son or daughter is 16 and you've waved the white flag where trying to have a conversation is concerned? Yes, I can see the point. I can see the point that if you apply the standards of the last couple of months where sexual harassment claims have been in the news, that a non-consensual kiss, well, yes, technically it is, but I really do think that all these things with your children should be not the subject of a letter to school, but a jumping off point for a conversation with your child, which I just think is the most important thing you can do as a parent.
It's something you've often talked about, the importance of being able to talk to our children right from a very young age, isn't it?
I feel really, really strongly about that. That obviously in the Parents podcast crew, I'm the one with the children who are the oldest. And let me say to you, Tim, that is 24 and 22, too old for an advent calendar? No, it isn't. They've both written to us this week saying, don't forget my advent calendar, Mum, But I really do think, looking back, that the best thing we did as parents was that we never stopped talking to them. When the inevitable teenage storms arrive, if you have waved the white flag on talking to your children, you can't ever get it back.
I think my opinion's similar to yours. I do think she does raise some interesting and constructive points, but I certainly don't agree with everything she says. And like you, I think she underestimates the capacity of a 6-year-old child to differentiate between a fairy tale situation in which a fictional prince kisses a princess to break a decades-long curse and, say, a grown man sexually harassing a woman. Obviously not all children are the same, and I'm not making any judgments about this lady's son, but I do think that in many cases it is perfectly possible to hold quite a sensible conversation with a child of that age to explore how a fictional situation could cross over into a real-world context and then enable a discussion with the child about what is and isn't acceptable. I've had other conversations about similarly mature topics with each of our kids, either at or before the age of 6, and I'm sure you did as well.
Yeah. And I mean, just extending it, I read ferociously to our children. It was just one of the great pleasures of my life. And we read all sorts of things. We read fairy tales, Daniel had a book of Greek myths, and we went through the book of Greek myths from beginning to end any number of times. And gosh, I'm sure if I went and politically correctly analysed Greek myths, none of them would be acceptable. The story of the story of Icarus, of flying too close to the sun. Well, health and safety really didn't apply there, did it? And we should definitely not be retelling that Greek myth anymore. Trying to make a bird's wings with sealing wax, clearly that's not acceptable. I think all of these things, what I enjoyed so much about them was that we didn't just read the story, we talked about the story. If you want to be dreadfully politically incorrect, Eleanor, who's now a voracious reader and writer, I must have read every Famous Five book to her that there is, and yet, some of the language and some of the attitudes in Famous Five are now just would be completely unacceptable, and yet they continue to give vast amounts of pleasure to children and to parents.
Yeah, absolutely, and they're reflecting attitudes that are very much a product of their time.
Yeah, and I think that's the whole point. Actually, is that if you say we can't have these books anymore, then what you're doing is you're removing a large chunk of social history. One of the things I've just started watching Peaky Blinders on TV. What's interesting about it to me is the social history of Birmingham after the war, at a time when Britain was still a manufacturing country. You start and take all these things away, and then suddenly you've removed a large chunk of your social history. I can see the argument about the Cecil Rhodes statue, for example, but should we remove every statue that doesn't fit today's beliefs? No, we shouldn't.
And I think you make a really important point there. I do think that fairy tales and Greek mythology and period dramas should be used to create opportunities to promote conversations with kids and explore how our social norms and ethics and morals have changed. Okay, you don't necessarily want to turn every fairy tale into a learning opportunity because, well, that would be a bit excessive, wouldn't it? But absolutely, you can make a judgment call and hold back on some of these discussions for a later time so that kids can just enjoy being kids without having to turn every fairy tale into a morality tale.
I remember the first time we took the kids to watch any Shakespeare in live theatre, spending ages explaining that that woman was actually a man and that man was actually a woman. And, you've just got to talk about things afterwards. If you accept anything, so many things at face value, you can find something that's probably not there, really.
Now, going back to Sleeping Beauty for a minute, there's a sting in the tail. The original version of the story, written in the 16th century, tells the story of a princess who falls asleep in a castle and is subsequently raped by a king. When she wakes up, she miraculously falls in love with him, as you do, marries him, and they have twins together. Now, the Disney version that most of us are familiar with is thankfully somewhat different. So, Mark, is the background to this and the social context anything that even remotely occurred to you when you were reading fairy tales to your kids?
I didn't know about the original version of Sleeping Beauty until I read it in your email. But I think the answer is no. We kind of accepted them as good stories quite clearly. If you go into Cinderella, it's an immediate case where social services should be involved, isn't it? But we were essentially reading them as stories to be entertaining. And I suppose as someone who writes, I'm a big believer in the power of a story as opposed to, especially when you snuggled up on bed with a child, as opposed to analysing it too closely. But first and foremost, there were stories which we then talked about afterwards.
Yeah, and you talked about Cinderella and social services. It does make you wonder, actually, when you look into the classic fairy tales, how we should consider how the likes of Cinderella and Snow White and Beauty and the Beast play in a modern context. Take Cinderella as the example. Here we have a commentary on social class and family structures, a central protagonist whose destiny is driven not so much by her own actions as by the enablement provided by her fairy godmother. She has to be rescued from her fate by a dashing prince, etc., etc. And then there's Beauty and the Beast, which is basically a fairy tale case study of the effects of Stockholm Syndrome, where hostages form close emotional bonds with their captors over time, and so it goes on. So many old fairy tales do reflect the time they were written in. Times when women had very little agency of their own, which is what makes them seem so outdated in a modern context where women have much more control over their lives. And it does really show how much times have changed, I think, if you just look at the evolution of Disney princesses in recent years, and you can really see that journey. Just look at Anna and Elsa in Frozen, or Moana, who isn't going to let a demigod like Maui set the agenda for her. And then there's Wonder Woman, a female superhero whose worldview is built on having grown up in a world without men, where women could be whatever they want to be. Oh, and being the daughter of Zeus, I suppose that helps as well. So going back to where we started, is this whole non-consensual kiss story a case of political correctness gone mad? Maybe to a degree, but equally I think it's more of a two-sided argument than many commenters have given it credit for. And what it really underlines for me is the importance of having open communication with our children. We don't want to hide these stories away. We want to talk about them and maybe relate them to events in the real world. I do also wonder how the reaction might have been different if the question of the non-consensual kiss had been raised by a father rather than a mother. Pretty different, I'm willing to bet.
Posed by dad, yeah. I mean, just going back to your point about female heroes, I remember we had some very good friends who lived in Colchester in Essex, and I remember taking the kids into the museum in Colchester, and Eleanor being thoroughly engaged by the tale of Boudica or Boadicea or however you pronounce it now. And you know how it is with your kids. They have an obsession with something for about a month, and they read everything they can about it. And I remember telling stories about Boudica to Eleanor and reading books about her for a good solid month when she was, 6, 7, something like that. She did pick up on a very strong female character there.
So I guess this comes back to the point we were discussing earlier, that kids are actually much more perceptive about these topics, even from a young age. So as a parent, we can make a judgment of when the right time to have that dialogue is. And ultimately, it does all come down to communication.
It does all come back to communication, yeah. And every time, if Tony Blair said, these are my three priorities for government and education, I think my three priorities for parenting would be communication, and communication.
In a different vein, a chain of nurseries in the south of England has banned glitter in the making of Christmas cards and decorations because of concerns over the damage it does to the environment. They're now sourcing alternative materials for use in festive art and craft activities. So again, Mark, what's your immediate reaction to this story? Is it something that we should be applauding because it raises awareness of environmental impact? Or is it a case of the fun police wading in and spoiling kids' innocent enjoyment?
I actually read this about half an hour after I'd seen Blue Planet on the damage that plastic was doing to the oceans. So I was a bit on my environmental high horse at that point. I'm not sure that I see glitter as essential to the Christmas festivities or the Christmas story. Maybe that's me getting to the stage where my children are much older now and I'm getting a bit old and curmudgeonly. I am increasingly, as I get older, I'm much more pro-environment. I think about the environment much more than I ever did. If somebody could prove to me that glitter was damaging to the environment, which I'm not sure that this nursery did, but I'm quite prepared to be persuaded of the argument, then I'm probably in favour of what they've done, because I'm not sure that glitter is essential to a child's upbringing.
As much as our kids love glitter, there are obviously plenty of other ways for them to have fun doing arty stuff. And I guess my view on it is that, like you, I've become much more environmentally conscious as I've grown older. By the same token, I'm not going to be so militant about it that I'm going to ostracise individual parents who allow their kids to use glitter, but equally, if it's being used on the kind of scale that nurseries use it, I think you have to applaud this kind of move as setting a good social example. And certainly there are environmental experts who will speak to the damage that glitter can cause. After all, it's a single-use microplastic that can find its way into the water system and end up in the food chain with negative impacts on the environment. Now, is it one of the main causes of environmental damage to our oceans? Probably not, but it must surely have an impact. I mean, there's enough crap already polluting our seas and oceans without nurseries generating thousands of tons of glitter waste on top of that, surely.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, living by the seaside, you just occasionally see the amount of and the North Sea. We are not particularly a beach on which things get washed up, but the amount of rubbish and people go down on the beach on November the 5th and just leave any amount of rubbish on the beach thinking that the tide will clean it up for them. And it's an absolutely dreadful attitude to have. When you watch the Blue Planet, and I'm sure you've also seen on YouTube the film of the South Sea Island somewhere off Australia, where there's so many plastic bottles washed up on this island that they've choked all life on it. I mean, it's just absolutely dreadful.
As you touched on earlier, even Sir David Attenborough has referred to the amount of plastics in our seas as being one of the greatest environmental scourges of modern times. And I think if he's saying it, we have to listen. I mean, there's a reason the series is called Blue Planet and not Gold, Silver and other sparkly colours Planet, right?
Quite so, yeah.
I mean, awareness is a powerful thing, and it's the first weapon in the fight to preserve the environment. So do you think most parents would be supportive of the nursery's stance in banning glitter in the knowledge of its environmental impact?
I would like to think so, but I rather suspect a good number of parents would think it's glitter, it's Christmas. What's a bit of glitter? What difference is a little bit of glitter going to make? Because you tend to do that, don't you? You know, you think it's only a little bit, but all these little bits add up.
Certainly our experience with our kids' nursery and preschool is that they were very conscious about reusing and recycling materials, and it was something they did educate the kids about, and certainly a lot more than when you and I were kids.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Time marches on, but I quickly wanted to touch on a couple more stories that caught my eye recently. So this story annoyed the hell out of me when I saw it a few days back. A family renting in London have been threatened with eviction after complaints that their baby was crying. They're currently living in a privately rented top floor flat in a converted house in West London, but they've been warned by the management firm that if the noise goes on they could be given 2 weeks' notice to vacate. Now these parents have a 15-month-old daughter and a 3-year-old son. They're saying it's horrible discrimination against families renting with children. Now, of course, we have to be careful that there are always two sides to every story, but if we take what they're saying at face value and the neighbours are essentially complaining about something as simple as a baby crying, do they have a point in feeling discriminated against?
It's really difficult, isn't it? Because one baby's crying is another neighbour's persistent wailing. And babies do cry, and parents do shout at babies when they are crying. I find this a really difficult one because without hearing the noise, I find it almost impossible to judge. What I will say is that when you have young children yourself, you don't really notice children crying. As your children get older, the sound of babies crying actually becomes quite irritating. I suspect it will swing back the other way when I'm presented with a grandchild and I find it a lovely sound again. But I can absolutely see both sides of the coin here. You don't know the neighbour's side of the story, do you? You don't know what action the parents are taking. You don't know how do parents react. You know, do they try and get the baby off to sleep, or do they just let it cry? I think this is a really, really difficult one. But as you say, you know, ever increasing numbers of people are having to rent. And if you know, are we going to now say that the rental market is restricted to people who have two incomes, neither of whom are on benefits, and neither of whom have any children? Well, that is going to present dreadful social problems, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are thousands upon thousands of young families, especially those living in London and other major cities where it's expensive and all but impossible to afford buying a house, even if you have two reasonable incomes. And you have to wonder, should this ever go to court? And I'm not a legal expert, so I don't know whether the management company has a leg to stand on in terms of their ability to enforce an eviction. I guess they probably do, and there will be some relevant clauses included in all tenants' contracts that allow them to do just that.
Britain is traditionally a nation of pet lovers. Well, actually, the number of families who have a pet is now falling. And why is that? That's because more people are living in rented accommodation, and you can't have pets in rented accommodation. You know, if we're now to say that renting is only for people who don't have children or who have perfectly behaved children, well, that's just going to make the housing crisis even worse, isn't it?
I mean, again, we don't know the individual circumstances, but one thing we do know for sure is that bringing up a baby, and babies do cry, it's a stressful situation to start with. And then if you've got the additional worry of neighbours complaining about you and the threat of an eviction notice, that's only going to make things even more stressful. And this whole thing will have soured the relationship between the family and their neighbours, probably beyond repair. I mean, it's just not a great way to handle a situation that should really have been dealt with any number of different and more civilised ways. And you do have to worry. what kind of a precedent this might set for other young families who are renting in similar circumstances. And it's just not great. Not great at all. Finally, let's talk about a new character who's aimed squarely at girls. Now, I grew up with the Mr. Men books, and our kids have all enjoyed them too. Nearly 50 years after the series first began, they're still going strong, courtesy of Adam Hargreaves, son of the original creator Roger. Now, next year we'll see the introduction of a new Little Miss character, Little Miss Inventor, who will be characterised by having pencils and a spanner in her green hair. Now, a lot of the previous Little Miss characters were either just female replicas of Mr. Men counterparts, or, I guess a bit like we were saying earlier about fairy tales, they were a product of their times, coming from a different era that cast them as what we would now consider to be outdated stereotypes. Anyhow, the new book's going to be released on March the 8th next year, so that ties in with International Women's Day and British Science Week. It's hoped that the book will play a part in encouraging more girls to pursue STEM subjects at school, so that's science, technology, engineering and maths. Now, Mark, this is a good thing, isn't it?
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah, why would you not have Little Miss Engineer, Doctor, Consultant, Little Miss Prime Minister? Well, why would you not have any of those?
Yeah, I think it's great, personally. I mean, it's not earth-shattering in and of itself, but aligned with wider movements such as International Women's Day and British Science Week, it's just another cog in a bigger machine. So, for me, yeah, absolutely, let's have more of this kind of stuff. But, playing devil's advocate for a minute, is there an argument, though, that having a female character with messy green hair with spanners and stuff in her hair might be off-putting for girls, or maybe perpetuate an old stereotype of what scientists are like?
I don't think that's a problem at all. I was talking to the daughter of one of my friends the other day. She's going off to sixth form college to do maths and further maths and physics. She wants to be an engineer. She said, look, that's what I am. You know, I'm a nerd or a geek or whatever you want to call me. I'm proud of it. You know, that's what I am. I want to be an engineer. I want to do maths and further maths. I love doing it. I'm better than every boy that I know. That's the way I'm put together.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's not something that I'm worried about at all myself. I mean, you know, the Mr. Men and Little Misses have always been visual caricatures to set them apart from one another. And, you know, again, going back to something we were talking about earlier, you would hope that kids can tell the difference between an exaggerated cartoon character and real life. Now that brings me on to another related thought. I wonder what other Little Miss characters we could have to encourage and celebrate diverse female role models, or to be more inclusive. So how about a Muslim Little Miss, or indeed one celebrating any other different ethnicity? Or how about a Little Miss who has a girlfriend? The possibilities are endless. Mark, any ideas for future characters?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'd like to see Little Miss Entrepreneur. I think anything you can do to get the idea across to girls. It's certainly something that I've said to my daughter time and time again, that I expect you to end up running your own business. You know, Little Miss Writer is another one that I've permanently said to her. I don't see a problem with anything that you come up with, really.
Well, I look forward to the day when there are Little Miss stories based on the exploits of both your Eleanor and our Cara. So before we go, Mark, what have you been up to recently?
Oh, I just had a thrilling week last week, Tim, where I was writing about the budget for clients for 3 days non-stop. That was... But the Samaritans have said that I should be all right, that it should gradually work its way out of my system. Apart from that, of course, I've got the book out, and I seem to spend every every waking moment promoting the book now that it's out, which you have to do. Got the paperback out now as well, Father, Son and the Pennine Way by Mark Richards, available on Amazon, and I think a really good Christmas present for the man in your life.
As for me, a couple of things, I guess. So, I recently did my first Facebook Live, which turned out to be the living embodiment of Murphy's Law, as everything that could go wrong did go wrong. From a Skype connection that kept dropping every 5 to 10 minutes to, at one stage, me re-establishing my broadcast in a different Facebook group to the one I was supposed to be in. And this is probably why I should just stick to podcasts. On a more positive note, we were at Longleat last weekend to see their Festival of Light. Now, this is a collection of gigantic Chinese lanterns, some of them up to 50 feet or more in height or length. And ironically, given what we've been talking about this evening, each of them was depicting a well-known fairy tale, everything from Cinderella to Sleeping Beauty. So thankfully, no non-consensual kisses, I'm happy to report. They were fantastic. The detailing is amazing, and they really do light up the night sky brilliantly. It's well worth a visit if anyone's able to get there. And no, I'm not working on commission. And that's it for this episode of the Meet the Parents podcast. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with our bumper Christmas edition, but in the meantime, here's where you can find the two of us online. Mark?
So I'm at Best Dad I Can Be on Twitter, and the website is markrichards.co.uk.
And I'm at Thatcham Dad on social media, and my blog is slouchingtowardsthatcham.com. So you can download this podcast on iTunes and Android devices, on our website at meettheparentspodcast.com, and via a variety of podcasting apps. You can also follow us on Twitter at ParentsPodcast and Facebook at facebook.com/meettheparentspodcast. So thank you for listening, and do please join us again in a couple of weeks' time. Good night.